Okay. So, I actually have... Actually, I'll go ahead and change this back to what we had before. I just put this up on Blackboard like 10 minutes ago. So I had actually gotten ahead of myself with what the paper topic was. The progressive era thing, that's actually the second paper. So the first paper topic is actually something we've already gone over. The like movement west. So yeah, it's what you think is the most important reason for the movement west, or the most like the biggest drive for the movement west. Yeah, one of the big reasons was the Homestead Act. I mean, that's a big obvious thing. There's railroads or the gold rush. Just lots of things you can talk about. Just pick any one that you think is most interesting. Or if you want, as many of you, I mean, most of you have had my class before, choose whatever you think is most interesting and go from there. Let me make sure that my online people actually can hear me. Okay, good. That is going to be due on March 6th. Yeah, which is the first week of March. The first Wednesday of March. So I'm giving you to at least the middle of that first week. Yeah, so this is up on Blackboard. 2 to 3 pages, double spaced. Make sure you give me a works cited and bibliography. Make sure you cite your sources, which will be nice whenever you, especially if you're using citations, or not citations, but you're using quotations. That's important. If you want to do something besides the default topic here, again, that's not only allowed but encouraged, but make sure you bring it up to me beforehand just to let me know, because I want to make sure you're not trying to do something too broad. That's usually a bigger problem than trying to do something too narrow. Sometimes people are like, oh, I want to do, Thomas Edison. I want to talk about Thomas Edison's life. That's a little bit too broad. There's a lot to talk about with Thomas Edison. You can talk about something like, Thomas Edison inventing a certain thing. That's enough for a 2 to 3 page paper. In fact, that's probably still, you can do more than 2 to 3 pages on him inventing something besides the light bulb. But anyway, point being, if you want to do something besides this, just let me know so I can make sure you're not getting in over your head. Yeah, so from Reconstruction era to like Industrial Revolution-ish, because after that is going to be the second paper. Any questions about this? So again, you've got more than a month to worry about this. We've already basically gone over the topic for this. But if you want to do other stuff, you're more than welcome to. So, where's my mouse? It's probably over here. There it is. Grab that, get that out of the way. And don't save. And I'll put the other one up later. All right. Let me make sure real quick that where's my internet? Channel dashboard, there it is. Dude. Is it right? Yes. Okay. And then it's got to do that. Why? All right. So, back to the notes from last time. So, we pretty much finished chapter 15 last time, and as I said, once we finish 16, that will be the first test. And based on how much I did with my Tuesday, Thursday class last time, we will not be doing the test this week. At most, we might be finishing the notes on Wednesday, maybe, but we will still have the study guide and stuff, next Monday, and then the test after that. So, as always, we'll have study guide and review day, and then test time. So, no suddenly test. So, and we're just now starting this chapter, and this one's a little bit longer than the others. So, this is where we left off, which was just the start of the chapter, the start of the Second Industrial Revolution. Again, railroads being the main part, which influenced a lot of the other industries. Got here. This is actually a pretty good image for the Second Industrial Revolution. Railroads, factories, business tycoons making big profits, labor unions, which we'll get into next chapter, electricity, communications, which again we'll talk more about a little bit later on, transportations, industrial workers not doing so well, business organization, and steel and oil industries. And again, no such thing as child labor laws or safety practices at all. This is definitely one of my favorite images when it comes to just the level of business practices back then. And Transcontinental Railroad, steel mills. Oh no. Oop. And this is the better image of the rail line, or the time zones rather, thanks to the rail lines. All right. So, something we talk about in my 104 course is during the first Industrial Revolution, this wave of gadgets, as the topic is called, wherein due to the population and relative wealth of the region, there's just like a wave of small inventions that happened over a relatively small period of time that quickly grow into a massive influx of technology. So same with the Second Industrial Revolution in America. It's these smaller inventions that quickly grew into the larger technological growth. The various brilliant minds, the resources, and desire to improve. So this is just a large list of dates and items that were invented. Obviously, you're not going to need to know all this, but I just like to have a timeline of how quickly these things were invented all in rapid succession. In 1866, the transatlantic telegraph line connected America and Europe. I'll show you an image of that in a minute. Typewriters in 68, carbon paper in 72, adding machines in 91, mimeograph machines in 92. Mimeograph machines were like copying machines, but in this weird way where like you wrote on one and it sort of it moved like another stencil. I don't know. I've got a picture of one and I still can't quite explain what they do. Um, Skyscrapers became possible in the 1880s due not only to structural steel, which we'll talk about in greater detail later, but also the Otis safety elevator, which made it so that if the elevator failed, you wouldn't fall to a horrible death. The emergency brakes in safety elevators, which most elevators you get on even today, when you walk in and there's like that little bit of shiny metal down at the bottom when the doors open, it typically will say Otis there. Most elevators use Otis brakes. Alexander Graham's telephone. In 1880, 55 cities used local service. By 1890, long-distance lines connected New York, Boston, and Chicago. In 1900, there were 1.5 million telephones. Of course, he made money with this, creating the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, also known as AT&T. That's one of the T's is literally telegraph. In 1885. Also, I should note that very few of these inventions were created in a bubble. Many of these were being created in competition with other people trying to create the same thing, and they were just created first. I'm sure Otis was not the only person trying to create brakes for an elevator. He was just the first one to do it successfully. Alexander Graham Bell not only was the first one to successfully create a device that could transmit sound over long distance, he submitted his patent on the same day as another man submitting the same patent. He just submitted it earlier that morning. So therefore his was accepted first, and therefore he got the patent. Like that's how close people were to making the same thing. Steel innovations, furnaces burning out impurities, turning iron into stronger, lighter steel. Steel is just better than iron when it comes to building things. Iron does have its use, but steel is lighter and stronger, and when it comes to building stuff, that's just better. And when furnaces are able to make it better and faster, it becomes cheaper, and therefore you can make more of it. So in 1860, we had about 13,000 tons a year, whereas in 1910, there was about 28 million tons a year. In the 1800s, steel was very, very difficult to make. It was very rare. Again, when we talked about the plows in the West, it wasn't steel plows, it was steel tipped plows. You could only make enough to just like cover the end of it because it was so expensive to produce. And also, due to all this machinery that was being made, you needed to lubricate everything, so the oil industry became big and important, but not for the reasons it is today. So 1859, the oil industry was a thing, but again, mostly for lubricating machine parts. Automobile use didn't start until about 1900 because, well, again, early on, lubrication. Then kerosene became a thing for, lighting homes. And there was a wasted byproduct called gasoline that was made. That was seen as too volatile to be used for anything, useful. It wasn't any good. And then eventually the internal combustion engine was created, which is to say they made an engine strong enough to contain the volatile gasoline and made it useful for production. So, yeah, gasoline was this waste byproduct at first. So here we have the telegraph lines in the 1800s. When I was in Ireland, where's my mouse? I was walking on the cliffs outside Dublin. Well, Howth, but Howth's right outside Dublin. And there was like this wooden placard, or it looked like a cross, but then we got close to it and it had a sign that said, down in the water here is the transatlantic telegraph line connecting America to Britain, and it was this part of the line. So that was neat. And basically it was, do not dredge here, you're going to hit in a really high voltage line. And, if you haven't ever seen a typewriter before, here's a really old one. Weighs like 50 pounds. And, carbon paper. If you've ever seen a check, people don't even write checks anymore. An adding machine. These old adding machines. My grandfather had one of these. Again, very heavy. This is what a mimeograph machine was. I'm still not 100% sure what it was supposed to do. I didn't do a whole lot of research on it. They're just weird. This was the first skyscraper in America. This is the Flatiron Building in New York. For those of you in the know, this is also where the Daily Bugle is. It's where Peter Parker makes his very small paychecks. Also, one of my favorite images from this set, this is Otis proving that his elevators work, or his brakes work, rather. So he built this platform and had them raise him up and cut the line with him standing on it in, barrels and boxes and stuff to help weigh it down. And it dropped, and with the mechanism exposed so that when it caught, that people could see it. And it's like, see, it's all safe. And if it didn't work, he wouldn't be around for people to yell at. I mean, that is trusting your product. But that was how you did it back then. If your product was potentially not safe, you would go out and prove that it was safe at your own peril. And this is the very famous image of Bell demonstrating his telephone. And the early lines of the AT&T company. Metallic circuit connections. It's interesting, some of the old terms like that, metallic circuit connections. Anyway, line go up, steel production. Sometimes you don't find interesting images. Oh, right. This was the first oil well in North America. This was in Pennsylvania. That was the first place they struck oil here in the United States. And this was what the first oil wells looked like, these weird wooden buildings. And, kerosene lamps. Actually got one of those. They call them hurricane lanterns now. When all the power goes out, you just have one of these. All right, something else they used petroleum for. Vaseline. Vaseline's made out of petroleum, if you weren't aware. And Vaseline's used for all sorts of stuff. And especially back then, they used it for everything. Cures dandruff, for irritation of skin, infant chafing, for pimples, blotches, etc. Excellent for toilet soap. Yeah, Vaseline's and everything. Cure. Oh, and also the first car, which was in Germany. That's a Mercedes. All right. Some more stuff. Railroads, of course, benefited from the wave of inventions. Air brakes, automatic coupling devices. It should be mentioned that before air brakes, the way brakes worked in trains were that each car had its own very manual brake. You had to pull a lever on every car, and when it came to box cars, it was a lever on the top of every car. And if you needed to stop a train in a hurry, the conductor, well, one of the conductors, because there was always more than one, had to run along the top of the train, pulling the lever, jump into the next car, pulling the lever, and so on. That tended to kill a lot of conductors because, I mean, the train's at that point usually out of control, and you're running as quickly as you can, pulling these levers that are usually not going to be too easy to pull while the train's rumbling down the track. So with the air brakes, you pull a lever in the locomotive, and it opens up the pneumatic lines and hits the brakes on everything all at once, and all is well, usually. Automatic coupling devices, it just makes it easier to lock everything down. I'll show you one of those in a minute. Elijah McCoy was a trained engineer, son of former slaves. Due to racial discrimination, had to work menial jobs such as lubricating train parts. They had to stop every few miles to have the train parts lubricated because, well, you don't want the train to catch on fire due to the parts getting hot. So he invented an automatic lubricating device to make it so that the parts would maintain lubrication and not burst into flames. So early on, these inventions typically came from individuals, but like everything else, they gradually became consolidated into larger corporations, such as Thomas freaking Edison. He created a so-called invention factory at Menlo Park, brought together a team of inventors and craftsmen to churn out new technologies. According to Edison, genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. In his words, he wanted factories to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. He filed 1,093 patents in his life. Phonograph and motion pictures, which were his earlier inventions. And of course, the light bulb changed the way people lived and worked, which was safer than the gas lamps and allow factories to run all night, which was good for the factory owners, not so good for the workers. Now, it should be mentioned that most of the 1,093 patents that Edison filed were not things he invented. Most of them were things that his workers invented, but because they worked for him, he had the rights to them, because that was Edison. He was just very good at owning other people's work. He also worked with J.P. Morgan to form the Edison Electric Company in 1882, and within 10 years merged with several competitors. to create the General Electric Corporation, also known as GE. So it's Edison's fault we have GE. And as someone who used to tangentially work for GE, that kind of stuck out to me. And also, if you weren't aware, Nikola Tesla worked for Edison until Tesla began making things that went against what Edison wanted, because Tesla had a brain, and Edison kicked him out and then worked to destroy basically Tesla's livelihood. Yeah, Edison was, to put it nicely, kind of a dick. So, yeah, early on, train derailments were pretty common. Now, granted, trains didn't move especially fast back then, so a lot of the time, train derailments weren't too big of a deal. In fact, a lot of the time, they just kind of skipped the track, just sort of popped off the track, and if they were, especially if they were passenger trains, the conductor would just like ask the people to get off the train and help push them back onto the track, and they'd get back on their way. So here's the pneumatic braking device. You know, you just open the valve and it runs the air through and activates the brakes. Pretty simple. Who is calling me while I'm trying to work? There's the automatic coupling device. If you've ever seen a train, you know what these look like. Where you can just back one car into another, and they click together automatically. And then, again, you have to hook the pneumatic lines manually, but the big part is done on its own, which saves a lot of time. And then I've got a cross section here of the automatic lubrication device. There's Menlo Park. And then they moved to a larger, there's inside of Menlo Park. Moved to a larger factory here. I don't remember exactly where this is. I used to remember, but it's been a little while. There's the inside. If you've ever been in even a high school, or I guess my memory, a college level chemistry lab, this will look real familiar. I mean, it's just, a bunch of tables and glass stoppered bottles and stuff. However, there's no kind of ventilation system because, obviously they didn't have any back then, but makes this area a bit more dangerous. They've got like a fan. And here's one of the earliest light bulbs, which it did take a lot of tries. And again, it wasn't that Edison was the only one sitting there working on it. He had all those people working in his factory working on different versions and, trying to make the vacuum seal work and have the filament work correctly and make sure they run the correct amount of electricity through. It was a lot of trial and error. And when you've got a bunch of people working for you, you can get through that trial and error more quickly. He's like, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways it won't work. It's like, no, you're the people working for you found 10,000 ways that don't work. And there's Tesla demonstrating some rather dramatic uses of electricity. Edison Electric Company. And then another one here, a bigger shot with the trains running by, which is always important because next to the rivers using steamboats, the trains were certainly the artery of the nation. And here's just like a random GE building that I wanted to use for a couple of reasons. One, if you've never seen a GE building, excuse me, but also when I was putting this together, I was still working security at one. And they would have had us like in this section. It's like this is where all the visitors go with these nice fancy wrought iron fences, but nobody goes to this part where the wrought iron fences end. And it's just, don't worry about that. Make sure everything looks nice where the visitors are going to be and like the big wigs. And why do the lights turn off? Okay. But why is it? I don't know why the timer is being weird. All right. So on to more stuff. So there was this idea of a new South. Post-Civil War, with this growing technology, I did get a voicemail. The Atlanta Constitution editor, Henry Grady, believed that the defeat of the Confederacy was due to the North's superior manufacturing output and railroad supply lines, which, I mean, I guess wasn't totally incorrect. The editor of Manufacturer's Record, Richard Edmonds, discussed the virtues of the real South. The music of progress, whir of the spindle, buzz of the saw, roar of the furnace, throb of the locomotive. Basically, this idea of industrial progress in the South while still remaining somewhat agrarian. The regional separatism to give way to joining with the national economy, while remaining true to its own heritage, I suppose. Obviously, railroads, as I said, it's going to be lots of railroads here. So railroads connected the North and the South. It also had a big impact on the textile industry. So there was still plenty of cotton in the South. I mean, sure, no more slavery, but, well, no more slavery technically. But there's still lots of cotton. The labor in the South was still cheap, even if, again, slavery was technically outlawed. And now we've got railroads running through the South, so it's easier and cheaper to move raw resources and finished goods back and forth. So textile mills began cropping up all over the South, in particular Georgia and here in the Carolinas. Owners typically hired girls and young women because they could be paid less. But most of the time I had to hire entire families because fathers wouldn't let their daughters move out unsupervised. So for the most part, white families that had lost their farms due to failing crop prices were able to maintain some level of financial security because they were able to move into these factories and work for a relatively decent wage. Again, not great, but it was something. Black families were left doing the most menial work, which is to say typically still very much working in the cotton fields. They also were a major part of working to build railroads, but very rarely were paid for it. This was the convict lease system where blacks were used, or where black convicts were used for labor, typically jailed with the black code laws. Hired out by private companies to serve their time or pay off fines. So this brought in lots of money for the state, provided cheap labor for companies, but African American workers were impoverished and essentially left enslaved. Because again, that was the loophole in the 13th Amendment, and they jumped right on that. And it's still there. So here is Henry Grady. In case you wanted to know what Henry Grady looked like. And here's a book about Henry Grady. Henry Grady's New South, Atlanta, a brave and beautiful city. I don't know if Harold E. Davis has Harold E. Davis has seen Atlanta. Here's a distribution of wealth. Again, mostly in the Northeast, and not nearly as much in the South. Railroads, again, mostly in the Northeast, but some moving there in the South. You can see we've got actually not a bad amount here. And textile mills, can you just put the girls to work because you don't have to pay them as much, and you just string a little light bulb from the ceiling and just have them work all night. Who cares? And this is a hell of an image. Just shows you how big these places were. It just goes off into the distance. Then outside you've got the black families collecting the cotton because things rarely changed. And then convict lease system using mostly black convicts, which, I mean, again, it technically was any convicts, but it was mostly black convicts because, again, this is the South in the 1800s. Here is an interesting book by Matthew Mancini, Convict Leasing in the American South, One Dies, Get Another. The quote they used here, before the war we owned, let's just say, the slaves. A Southern businessman reflected nostalgically, if a man had a good slave, he could afford to keep him. But these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another. Which is to say, when slavery was a thing, there was a certain level of economic incentive to not kill them because, you know, they were an investment. But now that's a convict system, and they're using, you know, unfair laws to just pack the jails full. Who cares? So it's somehow even worse. So the New South was more than just textiles. We had James B. Duke establish his cigarette manufacturing empire in Durham, North Carolina. So if you're familiar at all with anything in North Carolina, which is to say everything is named Duke something, that's because of this dude. Tobacco fields worked, of course, by black laborers, provided the raw materials for the white workers who rolled cigarettes by machine, which that implies they weren't using their hands. They certainly were, but the machines were there to ensure they were rolled to a certain standard. Also, lots of acres of pine trees in the Carolinas, Florida, Alabama. We still have quite a few pine forests here in the South. So lots of lumber for both blacks and whites to work. Coal and iron in Alabama, so that's why Birmingham even exists. So a decent steel industry. Over 1 million tons of steel by the turn of the 20th century. So the South was doing relatively well in terms of industrial output compared to even just a few decades before. Now that said, the New South was not that different from the Old South. Northern investors were still required to create the industries, and these investors came in due to the cheap labor of the South, because, again, the South was essentially permanently impoverished. And if you're willing to pay like 15 cents more than the people are used to making, then they're more than happy to work for whatever. Workers remained impoverished. They were often unable to purchase what they were often making. Much of the South even remained agrarian. They would refuse to diversify their production, which was not great for market changes. Often due to the sharecroppers, because they had such small plots of land they couldn't really even afford to diversify. Which was fine with the people who actually had the money in the South, the Southern elite, because they liked to keep things the way they were. As long as they kept the poor and the systems of forced labor in place, they were fine with the way they were, because if the poor was kept on the back foot, then they wouldn't be coming for the rich. So things didn't change a great deal in the South. I mean, there was change, but not like on an institutional level. Also, I should mention James B. Duke here. Duke University is technically not named after him. He did fund it, and they wanted to name it after him, and he refused. He said, "No, I will name it after my father." It's like, it's still called Duke University, dude. Like, just because it's named after your dad, we don't call it James Duke's daddy's university. It's just Duke University. So yeah, Duke everything in North Carolina, it's because of this guy. And here's the cigarette rolling. Needs to say everything in here is extremely flammable. I think this is outside of a cigarette factory. You can see a rather wide range in ages of these workers. I mean, some of these girls are pretty young. It's like, nah, go in there and make cigarettes. Make 5 cents a day. I think this is a bit more recent than the 1800s. This looks like a pretty recent tractor up here, or even yeah, that's a tractor. But same idea, harvesting tobacco. And here's your pine forest. I specifically grabbed this because when I was working in the upstate, there actually weren't as many pine forests, which, I mean, this image shows you pretty well, because I was actually past this line. I was kind of in the Piedmont. And once you pass that region, there's less pine trees. It's more broadleafs. And you do kind of start to miss the pine trees and the, like, clay dirt everywhere. even though you do kind of get bored of that when you're down here all the time. And I mentioned that I did kind of miss where you could just turn off any road anywhere and you're just in the middle of a pine forest with red clay. So I had that image. Anyway, this is an iron foundry. They run the ore up a conveyor belt here into, usually there's a furnace there. It's kind of hard to tell with these images. Oh yeah, I hope you're not claustrophobic. There's a coal mine. Ugh. There's another mine shaft. This is the surface level mine. Just kind of dig it out from where you are. Alright, let's do some industrial stuff. We got a little bit of time left. We got enough time left to do a few things. Alright. So besides all the industrial stuff, there was also ruthless business practices. And that was another, like, typical thing you saw in the 19th century. Businesses would destroy each other to try to get ahead. They'd buy out or just destroy each other, and due to the machinery that was basically now required for all of this industry, they had to try to save money elsewhere. One of the ways was to increase output. This was known as economy of scale. Basically, produce a bunch of stuff and attempt to lower costs by either lowering wages. So, you know, who cares about paying our workers a decent wage? Or lowering manufacturing costs. So, you know, finding a way to mass produce a product cheaply, essentially. A lot of times they could find a way to just, you know, mass produce something cheaply, but also they could often include paying their workers less in that to make even more money. Another tactic was vertical integration, where they would own not just the product, but the system to make that product. So one example was Andrew Carnegie combining its operations with Henry Clay Frick, who had access to coal. In other words, Andrew Carnegie had a steel empire. And in order to create steel, you need lots of coal to run your foundries. And Frick had access to coal, so rather than having to go through a third party to buy your coal, you have someone in your company who has access to that coal, so you don't have to go outside your company to get that coal. This vertical integration would also typically include like transportation, so you would either buy up or partner with someone in either the railroad industry or like a steamboat line, so you wouldn't have to pay someone for that. It was the whole from like again, to use steel as an example, from the iron mines to getting it to the final market. Like the entire process would be owned by you. You wouldn't just have the part where you refine the iron into steel. You would own the entire system, which meant that you would cut costs the whole way. Another system was horizontal integration, where you would acquire firms that created the same product to eliminate competition. That was kind of also known as monopoly, but we'll get to that in a little bit. John D. Rockefeller combined his Standard Oil Company with other competitors to own 4/5 of the market. So when you own 80% of the market, you can squeeze out smaller companies who couldn't afford to work against you. Basically, if you own most of the market and you've got competitors, you can afford to lower your cost to the point that you're even taking a loss. But your competitors can't afford to do that. And everyone's coming to you to buy the product, which in this case is oil. And eventually your competitors go out of business, and then you can get back to whatever price you want to go to. That's what it means by squeezing competitors out of market, is you can take a loss for a little while because your market is so, your part of the market is so big that you can afford to not make as much for a little while. So here's Carnegie. If you've ever seen the first Jurassic Park, he reminds me of, oh no, I lost his name, Hammond, John Hammond. But if you've ever read the first Jurassic Park book, he really reminds me of John Hammond, because John Hammond in the book was a dick, and Carnegie was definitely a dick. Carnegie didn't get eaten by dinosaurs, though. So here's Carnegie's steel mills. Here's Henry Clay Frick. Definitely not a terrible person. We will watch a video on on Carnegie and Frick a little bit later. So here's a book that I really need to get my hands on. Meet You in Hell, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and the Bitter Partnership That Transformed America. Yeah, I need to read this. Yeah, Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie hated each other. There's a little bit later, after the test, there we get into a there's a major strike at one of Carnegie's plants, and Carnegie knows it's coming, so he leaves the country and lets Frick take care of it. And Frick is very heavy-handed, to say the least, and it results in some people getting shot, including Frick, and Frick doesn't die. But due to the heavy-handedness that happens, Frick causes basically a lot of negative press for the company. And long story short, Carnegie and the shareholders end up firing Frick. And Frick's response is to, while still like bandaged up from being shot, chases Carnegie through the plant and proceeds to threaten to beat the hell out of him. It's really good. It's really, really amusing. He was a heck of a guy. So that's something we're gonna watch once we get to that. Anyway, here's Rockefeller. I don't think this man had a soul. He was. I mean, I talk about Frick. I don't think Carnegie possessed a soul. And again, from that same series that we're going to watch that video on, we're not really going to get to Rockefeller, but the guy who played Rockefeller didn't look quite like this, but played a really convincing, like, soulless human shell. The people that they got for that series did a really good job. Anyway, here's Rockefeller oil refineries. Speaking of oil refineries, here's Standard Oil. This is a common depiction of Standard Oil as like this big creepy octopus reaching into everything. You can see here how it's got its tentacles in basically how it's using its power to control government. You know, lobbying and using money to control government, a thing that doesn't exist anymore, thank goodness. And also how it's like crushing the common man. Sure is a good thing that money doesn't control politics anymore. So it wasn't just oil and steel. Telegraph industry used horizontal integration. Western Union got most of the federal telegraph contracts during the Civil War. Telegraphs, the way they worked, basically they would run the lines along railroad tracks. And whenever railroad depots would be built that would, service rail lines and, be where people would get on and off and whatever, that's where they would set up telegraph offices. So that's where you could send messages and receive messages, etc. It was a pretty good idea, to be perfectly honest. Like this is where the people are going. That's where people are going to need information. So you just run the line. Let's see, 76,000 miles of telegraph lines by 1861. Stock rose from 3 million to 41 million. Cornelius Vanderbilt bought the company. Vanderbilt was a major name in railroads as well, so he was involved in everything. Wall Street tycoon Jay Gould wanted to be involved. Eventually got in there by 1881. Merged Western Union and American Union Telegraph Company. Made $30 million in profit. The day after, New York Tribune reported the country finds itself this morning at the feet of a telegraphic monopoly. So, yeah, I mean, again, today, you think telegraph, that's an ancient thing that doesn't seem even worth talking about, but that was the major form of communication back then. I mean, today, you've got even just a couple of telephone companies. It seems like it shrinks every day. That's what it was back then, and they're constantly merging and getting fewer and fewer, and you've got more and more power in the hands of fewer people. So most of this consolidation was due to a handful of bankers. We mentioned John Pierpont Morgan was involved with the consolidation of General Electric. Worked as an investment banker, created his own investment firm in New York City, channeled funds from Great Britain to various investment projects, such as railroads, obviously. Refinanced a number of ailing railroads, put his men on the boards of directors to maintain a hold of them, which was how he made much of his fortune. Helped Carnegie merge several competing companies, created U.S. Steel, which became the world's largest corporation, worth $1.4 billion, and that's again in 1901 money. And by 1910, his investments held 340 directorships in 112 companies, worth $22 billion, and that's $608 billion in 2012 money, because that's when this book was written. Yeah, J.P. Morgan had a lot of money due to simply being involved in all these investments and mergings and all of that. All at a time when there was no income tax, should be mentioned. So here's the Western Union Telegraph Company. Again, you can kind of tell from the previous maps of the railroad railroads. This is going along the major railroads east and west, and then down south to Texas and the Mexico border. It goes down to Atlanta. It just kind of leaves us alone. I guess we're out of luck. It's Vanderbilt. You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Vanderbilt, of course, the guy that built the Biltmore mansion up in Asheville, North Carolina. Jay Gould, I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. You know, man of the people here. J.P. Morgan, man has two reasons for doing a thing. One sounds good, and one that sounds good, and a real one. Gold is money. Everything else is credit. I mean, gold is a shiny rock, but whatever, J.P. Morgan. I mean, which is true. Money's all fiat currency, which is just like this. It implies gold somewhere. All right, let me see. Let's get a little further so we can be closer to my Tuesday, Thursday class, and then we can go. All right. So before these big businesses, before the big corporations, the prior form of business was partnerships. Corporations allow for limited liability, which meant that you only risk the money that you put in. Corporations also allow for perpetual life. When one of the partners died, the partnership dissolved. Also, just a moment ago, limited liability. Also, if a partnership failed and they lost all their money, usually debtors would come for you because more money was required to pay off a debt than what you initially put in, and it was very risky. With limited liability, there was some amount of insurance involved that kept you from losing everything. With corporations, again, with perpetual life, they existed beyond any one partner, which again is why GE still exists, even though Edison's long gone, unless he's, a head in a jar somewhere. You never know. So capitalists, of course, work the system to their advantage. So monopolies were technically illegal. Rockefeller created a trust. This is that horizontal integration I was talking about earlier. So to not have a monopoly, technically, he didn't create a single company, but instead created multiple large companies that controlled the market, and then the leaders of all these companies sat on the board of trustees, which all answered to him. In other words, so actually to use the example, he didn't have a single Standard Oil of America company. He had Standard Oil of Pennsylvania and Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of Delaware, that sort of thing. And then each of the heads of those separate businesses would sit on a board of trustees, which was run by him, and he was like in charge of all of these business leaders that were all totally separate. Yeah. Also, because they had all the money, the court was on the side of these big businesses. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the corporations. They used the 14th Amendment to protect corporations as a person. So the federal law that was meant to protect African American civil rights was now used to avoid prohibitive government regulations. such as the number of work hours in a day. So now the amendment that was meant to protect African Americans from, being exploited was now protecting corporations from the government to not protect employees from the corporation. Yeah, seems legit. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was put together to codify a number of legal principles that were already in place, which is to say, hey, these laws already exist, but we're going to put them all in a single act to make sure everybody's aware they exist, and then immediately a ruling in favor of a sugar trust was made that basically made the act completely pointless. Basically, a sugar trust was ruled as a state activity, therefore not federal business, and the Sherman Antitrust Act was just essentially made useless. Here's another weird, creepy Standard Oil octopus. Looks like he's dancing. I really like that one. Reminds me of Kazora. And here's a weird railroad trust like centipede. We'll talk about railroad trust a little bit more later. That'll do it. There's more corporation stuff, but we'll do that on Wednesday.